All right, then let's continue on. So I'm going down to the JSON thing that's in here. So we'll go through that. We'll go through the web API. There's not that much more to do after that. So we should be done by 2 o'clock, I would think. All right. Notice JSON is the syntax for storing and exchanging data. It is the #1 way in Node of taking information and moving it around. So when we start on the Node stuff, which again is going to be probably like a week from Wednesday, something like that, when we do that, we're immediately going to start writing some applications, but they're going to be really simple, right? And they're purposely going to be really simple. And then hopefully the other thing too is you're going to see why you do certain things in certain ways. I'm going to take for granted that you have no problem asking a question. So as we go through this, I mean, the stuff we're doing right now, you might think this has been a waste of time or whatever. I don't know. It's meant to be a review. And what happened, some of the stuff, when I looked at some of the stuff that Paul's putting out there, it's much more simplistic than what we're doing. So, all right. So as it says, when you exchange data between a browser and a server, the data can only be text. JSON is text. That said, if you try to print out raw JSON, typically it's going to look weird, for lack of better words. So there's a parse and a stringify method that we'll get to. We talked a little bit about, but we'll talk about them again. In fact, in the example here, they create this object. It's pretty simple. It's got 3 attributes: a name, an age, and a city. When you work with this stuff, basically an object like this, and that's what it is, it's a JSON object. It has 3 fields in it. All right, each field has a key and it has a value, okay? And if we tried to print it out the way it was, it may print out, but it's probably going to look a little bit weird. So that's why you use this stringify thing, okay? Just for a little formatting. And when you go in the other direction, it's a parse. And they mention that on the receiving data. So when you send data, when you send JSON, you use stringify. When you receive it, you use parse. All right, there's an example of each one in there. It says when storing data, the data has to be in a certain format, regardless of where you choose to store it. Text is always one of the legal formats. JSON makes it possible to store JavaScript objects as text. So they say what it is there. I'm not going to read that. You can read it yourself. Why use it? You use it because it's the standard way of basically sending and receiving data between a client and a server. All right, I can't put it any plainer than that. The syntax is shown next. Notice again, data is in name value pairs. What's going to happen this semester is we're going to be using some tools. We're going to be using, for example, I don't know, I'm asking you this. Have you ever heard of a tool called Postman? All right, you're going to end up downloading it. Basically, it's just something that you're going to end up adding to Chrome. Now, I'm taking this online class right now, and this guy doesn't like Postman. So he uses another one. I didn't know it existed until today, or not today, Monday. It's called Insomnia, which to me sounds like a weird name for a tool, but it does pretty much the same thing Postman does. And if you don't want to use those, there's other ones. And if you don't want to use those, there's ways that you can take what happens in those tools and mock it without using the tools. You're going to learn a lot of that kind of stuff. So as it says, JSON data is written as name value pairs. There's an example, name : John. You'll notice that when you do this, that both the name or the key and the value are in double quotes. That's a JSON thing. That's not a JavaScript thing. But since we're using JavaScript with JSON, we're going to be doing it like that all the time. As it says, the JSON format is almost identical to the JavaScript object format. Okay, what's the difference? Can you see this where it says JSON evaluates to JavaScript objects? Can you see that? You see the 2 examples? You see the difference? How the actual key in JavaScript does not have to be inside of double quotes. Other than that, it pretty much looks the same. Although I believe in just regular JavaScript, you can put it in there also, and it won't hurt anything. All right. And JSON values must be one of the types that are shown there. Okay. As you can probably guess, you're not going to use something like null very often. But the other stuff that's in there, when you look at it, well, string, number, object, array, boolean. Well, number, number and boolean are simple objects, right? No. String is kind of in between a simple and a complex object, but an array and an object, those are more complex. For example, one of the first things that we're going to do, probably the first day we get into this, or at least the first week we're into it, we're going to write a simple application where we're going to put in some record data. We're not going to use a database. We're going to use a JSON file. We're going to put some record data in there. And then I'm going to show you how you can go and bring that data up, how you can add new data to it, how you can modify existing data, and how you can remove data. All right. As it says, in JSON, it must be one of those. In JavaScript, it can be any of the above, or it can be a function, a date, or undefined. So these three things, function, date, and undefined, are not valid JSON values. Does that make sense? All right. Again, JSON uses JavaScript syntax, and they show examples of that, several examples of it. JavaScript arrays as JSON, it says the same way. JavaScript objects can be used as JSON. JavaScript arrays can also be used as JSON. What does that mean? That means that if you're working on a program with JSON data, you can pass regular arrays like we've been using into it. The next one is JSON versus XML. Again, both of them are used. I already mentioned to you. A lot of people think that they won't even say AJAX anymore. It means asynchronous JavaScript and XML. They don't use XML at all. They use JSON because they're just comfortable with using this. One of the things that we're talking about doing this is, I'm just giving you a little of a side here. I don't know if it's going to happen or not. It may happen next year or in 2 years. We may get rid of the C# class. All right. What may happen is first semester, we might really expand the coverage and just give you a little bit of JavaScript at the end. Then the second class might be all JavaScript. And one of the things we're talking about, or one of the reasons that we're talking about doing this, we can get into JSON and XML and stuff like this that there's just not enough time to get into right now. Then the third semester would be the Node stuff, and the fourth semester might even change, because guess what? You can write Android and iOS applications today. You can use different packages, and you can write them in straight HTML and JavaScript now. So it's not that there's anything wrong with Android, but you don't need to use Kotlin or Java anymore for Android applications. You can write an Android application in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So the whole program here may eventually turn into a big JavaScript, HTML, JavaScript, etc. program. I don't know if I think that's a good thing or not a good thing. All right, I mean, it's because Evan kind of asked that. Paul wasn't real sure, and I wasn't real sure. So I guess that we'll see as we go on. All right, why JSON is better than XML? It's better because it's more JavaScript-like. That's what I'd say. All right. The valid data types we already mentioned. And then there's an example of using a string. There's an example under that of using a number. Notice that when you use the number, all right, don't put it in double quotes, because they've got their age 30. If you put it in double quotes, it's the string 30 with no numerical value. JSON objects, well, what you've got there is an object called employee, and an employee is made up of, an employee object has a name object, an age object, and a city object in it. Okay. There they're using arrays. So values in JSON can be arrays. They can be booleans, they can be null, and there's examples, like I said, of each one of those. All right, we talked a little bit earlier about Stringify and Parse, so the next one is Parse. As it says, a common use of JSON is to exchange data to and from a web server. When you receive it, the data is always in a string, so you parse it. And what that means is what that's going to do is a bit of formatting for it. So if we look at this example right here, it says, imagine we receive this text from a web server. That's straight JSON. That's the kind of stuff that we're going to do. Normally, when you receive it in most packages, each thing will be on its own line because you might have 20, 30 things that you're getting. All right. So it says when you use the JSON parse and you put it into a string, basically, if you look at the try it yourself that's on there, it's not a big thing, but it's just going to be a little bit easier to read. It strips off the JSON specific stuff, for lack of better words. Array versus JSON, which is about halfway down on the page here. It says when using the json.parse on a JSON derived from an array, the method will return a JavaScript array instead of a JavaScript object. Okay. Is that going to be a big thing? We're going to be working kind of back and forth between arrays and using non-array stuff. Stringify, the next one, again, already mentioned this. Stringify is the opposite. Okay? So when you send data to a web server, the data has to be put into a string. So that's when you use Stringify. So they run through the same exact kind of stuff, but instead of grabbing it from the server and giving it to the system, they're grabbing it from the system and giving it to the server. JSON object syntax, as it says, JSON objects are surrounded by curly braces. We've already seen that. They're key value pairs. I already mentioned that. The keys must be strings, and the values must be a valid JSON type, one of those that we just looked at. Each one is separated. You separate the key and the value by a colon. You don't have to put spaces. Sometimes people do, and you need a comma. This is one of those times when, to me, JavaScript's a little funky, because I've seen it already, that even, do you see the example that's there, name, age, and what is it, car? See that example? That usually, even after the word null, if you put another comma there, it wouldn't give you an error, where in a lot of programming languages it would. All right. You access the object using dot notation. Okay. So again, with the example right there, you should know that if I did my obj.name, it should return John. All right. And you can do it that way, or you can do it the other way we talked about yesterday, where you put it in the brackets. I have never seen anybody do it that other way that they show there. Although there's nothing wrong with it. You can loop through object properties, as it says, in a for in loop. I mentioned this yesterday. I'm going to keep some of the stuff I'm going to keep banging at you on. Do you see that example that they have right there, that with a for in? Mm-hmm. That variable x, that's being created on the fly. That's a brand new variable, and it lives until that loop that it's in goes away. Then that variable basically goes away. Okay. All right. You can put an object inside of an object, kind of what we looked at before, but if you take a look for the nested JSON objects, you can also have an array, where you use the brackets, and you can have JSON objects inside of an array. So you can have a whole bunch of them. I think they're going to probably talk about that next. Oh, they're going that way, okay. Yeah. Go down on the thing under JSON arrays. Go down about halfway, and it says nested arrays as JSON objects. Tell me when you get there. You see how they've got cars, and then it's got a bracket, then it's got a bunch of objects and then a bracket at the end. We're going to be doing stuff like that. So again, it may look a little weird. I don't think it's bad, and I think it'll make sense to you fairly quickly. We don't need to talk about JSON PHP. We don't need to talk, so we'll just go on to the JSON HTML. JSON can very easily be translated into JavaScript. JavaScript can be used to make HTML with the web pages, and it says there, make an HTML table with data received as JSON. All right, so there's some JSON data there, and if you run it, what you'll see is literally they created a table out of it. And it's not that big a thing, but the key takeaway there is if you look at the code that's in the example, they've got a json.parse. They have a drop-down list example. Finally, the last thing they talk about in this section is JSONp, and the P stands for padding. Okay, it says JSONp is a method for sending JSON data without worrying about these cross-domain issues. All right, it does not use an XML HTTP request object, rather it uses the script tag. Okay, so I'm not going to say it's more powerful, but it's another way of doing this. All right. The JS Web APIs, which is next here. It says a web API is a developer's dream. It can extend the functionality of the browser. It can greatly simplify complex functions. It can provide easy syntax to complex code. Before we even go into what they say, look at it this way. That I mentioned to you, Amazon's got an API. Google has an API. Virtually any company of any size has an API. I don't know if we did it with you. I don't believe we did. Did we ever do anything with a movies database? Okay, we probably will. We'll probably create an application where you use what's called the Imdb Database. And what it is it's they claim at least it's got virtually every movie since movies were invented. All right. So you go in there and maybe you make a drop-down list. And in that drop-down list, you've got different categories of movies. And you want to see, there's a really cool action movie and it was in 1923 and Clark Gable was in it. All right. But you have no idea what it was called or anything about it. So you'll be able to put in for information. You use the API to have it find it for you. So the idea is it's got all the information in there. You just got to figure out what you're looking for and then how to ask for it. All right, so as it says, API stands for Application Program Interface. A web API is an interface for the web. Well, that should make sense. All right, a browser API extends browser functionality. A server API extends server functionality. So they've got a browser API there. It says, for example, the Geolocation API can return the coordinates of where the browser is located. You've heard of that before. You know that you can have that kind of thing on your phone where you can let people know where you are, etc. All right. Some of this stuff too, have you ever, I'm originally from Wisconsin and I still follow the Packers. And when I get to certain sites, it'll say how they want to send me information, and with some of that stuff, sometimes too, what they'll do is they will ask about a location, all right, and they're using this kind of stuff. There's also third-party APIs, as they mentioned right there, and as it says, they're not built into the browser. They're not available directly. They're add-ons, for lack of better words. It says to use these, you have to download code from the web. That's what we're going to do when we do the stock market one. All right. Web History API, as it says, it provides easy methods to access the Windows history object. All right. We talked about back and forward and go. All right. And the main properties, they're all shown on the bottom of the particular slide. All right. I'm going to ask you a question. This is just a yes or no. The next slide is on web storage. Do you know what web storage is?
Kind of, but not really.
Okay, basically what you're able to do with web storage is you get a certain part of your system that you can use as though it's a database. Mm-hmm. So if you've got very small database-like applications that you want to create, but you really don't want to go through all the grief, let's just say, of creating a database application, you can use web storage for it. They say it's a simple syntax for storing and retrieving data in a web browser. Notice it's get item and it's set item. All right. The local storage object, as it says right there, provides access to local storage for a particular website. It lets you store stuff regarding that domain. There's a little bit more to it than that. So the set item stores something in storage. The get item retrieves it from storage. All right, as we go down there, there's a session storage object. As it says, it's identical to a local storage object. This is kind of important. The difference is the session storage object does it for one session. In other words, if you use session storage, it's available while you're logged in. Then it goes away. If you use local storage, it'll persist. So if you get out and get back into your application days, weeks, months, years later, it's still there unless you've removed it. All right. So just like with local storage, there is a session storage set item and a session storage get item. The properties for these are shown about 2/3 of the way down. Okay. Finally, we've already talked a little bit about this. They mentioned geolocation here. And as it says right there, the geolocation is used to get the geographical position of a user. Since this can compromise privacy, it's not available until the user approves it. All right. So in other words, if you want to know where you are at any time and you've got that turned on your phone, people can find out your latitude and longitude and track you usually. If you watch enough cop shows, I don't know if you do, but you watch like a Law and Order type of thing. What they'll do is they'll talk about things pinging off of other things and whatever, and that's what a lot of that stuff is. All right. Then they go into JavaScript versus jQuery, and they're going to just give you some different ways of doing the same thing. I'm not going to run through that. So you can take a look at that if you have an interest. And then jQuery Html. It says jQuery was released in 2006 by John Resig. It was designed to handle browser incompatibilities. No, to me, what jQuery does is it kind of supercharges CSS more than anything else. In my opinion, that's what it does. For more than 10 years, as it says, it's been the most popular JavaScript library in the world. Notice, after JavaScript version 5 in 2009, many of the jQuery utilities can be solved with just a few lines of standard JavaScript. It's funny, I told you I read this thing that's called medium.com, and today they had about a dozen articles in there, and some of them were hot JavaScript jobs in 2021, what to learn if you want to become a JavaScript programmer, etc. Then right at the bottom was, is JavaScript dying? So it's like anything else. It depends on who you talk to, who you listen to, who you believe. All right. But jQuery, the next one is jQuery CSS. All right. And really, more than anything else, that's the way that I use jQuery. As it says, to show elements, to style elements, etc. Finally, with the DOM, yeah, you can use jQuery with the DOM as well. You can remove elements from the DOM. You can add elements to the DOM, etc. And the last thing that's in here, well, two more things. There are a bunch of examples. Again, if you get some time, because we're done early today, just take a look at, you don't have to run every example in there. But there are going to be times when you may want to even go back to this when we do some of the stuff that we're going to be doing. All right. All right. There's that quiz. You might want to take that and see how you do. Finally, there's a JavaScript object reference at the very bottom. A little hard to work with, but I went through some of it. It's not bad. And there's also, what was the other one? Is it an HTML? I don't remember. There is an HTML DOM object reference at the bottom. So that gets done with this. All right. So next week, then what I plan on doing is we're going to go in and we're going to start writing more code and looking at code examples. I think that that's going to be more important for where we are. I might give you some articles, some documents and stuff, and just email it to you. But we're going to be looking at code. So unless you have any questions, the rest of the period then is yours.